Well, welcome back, everybody. Promise you'll get to spend a little bit of time outside in that fantastic weather. So setting up for the last session, no matter how hard you prepare for these things, there's always last-minute changes to agendas and so forth, and speakers that change. We have one change that's actually worthy of a round of applause. You'll notice that the first speaker tonight is listed on your agendas as Jane Winters, Reader in Digital Humanities. Jane's actually, as of this weekend, a bit earlier. Oh, okay. Well, we weren't quick enough then to write it down, but she's the professor of digital history. So congratulations. And she will be one of our panelists for our last session, followed with Helen Hockx-Yu, who's the head of web archiving at the British Library, and Josh Cowls, who is the research assistant at Oxford Internet Institute. Now, what we did in terms of the agenda was try to start quite large in terms of the big picture this morning before lunch, and then we spoke about obviously some small data, some very personal type of archiving examples. And we wanted to end off the day talking about something very topical, I think, to most of us in our organizations, which is big data research. And this esteemed panel will talk about what's happening in terms of big data in the UK domain. So without further ado, over to the three of you.
Thank you very much for the invitation to come along and speak today about the project, which is rather long-windedly called Big UK Domain Data for the Arts and Humanities. You'll be relieved to know that it's BUDA for short, so you won't hear the full version of that again. To put a little bit of context on this, for the first time in the UK, we got some investment in big data research, some serious investment for the arts and humanities. The Arts and Humanities Research Council had some funding to issue a big data call to start getting humanities researchers working with this material. And it was part of a digital transformations theme. And the aim was to address the challenges of working with big data, to look at whether those are unique for humanities researchers, what they might be able to bring to the discussion, and so on. A total of 21 projects were funded altogether, and a number of those were really quite large-scale collaborative projects, of which BUDA is one. They were large-scale, had a lot of partners, but they had to be done in 15 months. So it's been a bit of a scramble to get everything finished, and there are still some things that will be carrying on, I think, after the lifetime of the project. If you're interested in finding out a little bit more about it than I can talk about today, the project website is there, and I think the blog has been particularly successful because we've really tried to talk through our processes and highlight things that haven't worked as well as the things that have worked, so that other people can learn from what we've done and perhaps not go down the same paths that didn't end too well. 4 project partners, the Institute of Historical Research, where I am, and the British Library, the Oxford Internet Institute, and Aarhus University. And I think you'll recognise a lot of the names on there of people that are in the room today. The main aims of the project were to highlight the value of web archives for research, which is still a bit of a challenge given that most people, humanities researchers, historians, don't even really understand what a web archive is, and they think it's archival material online rather than something specific and very different. To work towards developing a theoretical and methodological framework to help humanities researchers analyse web archives, building on work that's gone on elsewhere, but trying to add our own bit to that story as well. The next one, to explore the ethical implications of big data research. That ties in very much with what Cathy Marshall was saying, and I'll touch a little bit more on that later on. Then very importantly, and I think this was a real key element of the project, was to inform collection development and access arrangements at the British Library, and you'll hear a bit more about that from Helen in the next talk. And then to train researchers in the use of big data, focusing on a small group initially, but moving that more widely subsequently. So the project outputs are enhanced interface providing access to the full text index for 1996 to 2013, which is held by the British Library, but as we've heard, was collected by the Internet Archive. An open access monograph, which Josh will talk a bit more about. An online training module so that we can start to get these skills out in the community, not just on a face-to-face basis, because that's not really very scalable. A couple of short animations explaining web archives to the general public, because that's very important to the British Library as well, that their main readership is the general public and people who aren't coming at it particularly necessarily from an academic perspective. and then a series of case studies showcasing precisely what you can do with this fantastic data. Very briefly, this is the search engine, the interface that's been developed. It's an ongoing work, as you can see from the warning at the top. This is a research prototype which may be taken down at any time, so make the most of it while it's still there. Helen's going to go through this in detail. This particular service probably won't last more than a couple of years, but it will feed in to the way the British Library makes the data available on site and elsewhere. And there's also the ubiquitous Ngram, which I've chosen the cheery subject of comparing Ebola, malaria, and tuberculosis in this particular example. This was very interesting, the way the researchers viewed this, and it took a lot of time for them to understand quite what they were looking at, because every single Ngram starts off looking very much like this one, and that's because of the way in which the data's been collected. So the trend lines are quite problematic. As the data set gets really bigger and more comprehensive, you start to get more meaningful results, but at the beginning, everything is a slow upward curve. So that needs a lot of unpicking. That's just a look at one of the little videos that we produced. We had a great public engagement event last November, a National Festival of Humanities in the UK, and we had a drop-in session for members of the public to come along and see what traces of them were left in the archive and their families and their workplaces. And these short animations really help people to get a grip on and understand what we meant by web archives and the sorts of things you could find in the UK Web Archive in particular. And actually, we thought it would be tricky explaining the concept to people without any background in it, but they actually got it very, very quickly. And we're thrilled simply to be able to find, for example, in one case, an elderly couple who found their Church Volunteer Society website from 10 years earlier. And they were absolutely fascinated to see what it looked like and feeding into family history and so on. So there's a lot of potential there that I think we could do more to exploit. At the heart of the project were some case studies, and the way we decided to do this was to offer 10 bursaries of £2,000 each to early career researchers. We decided not to prescribe what they could spend that money on. Essentially, we were buying their time and commitment to the project, and that's been very successful, and they've stayed with it right through the project, and we've got really good benefits from that. And I think now a group of people who are going to advocate for web archive research going forward. I'm a historian, but we didn't want to just use it for history. We wanted to look at a range of arts and humanities disciplines. The call was open not just to researchers in universities, but to lots of other areas as well. But in practice, we only got an application from one archivist and one independent researcher. The interest was really there from the academic researchers. And what we wanted them to do was to come up with projects that they would be researching anyway, and the sorts of questions that are central to the way that they work as humanities researchers, and then see how they could work with the British Library to develop tools that would help them to answer those questions. So really driven by the research agenda rather than by what was technically possible. And at the end, we asked them to produce a case study of at least 2,000 words. And I think it's a sign of the enthusiasm with which this group took it up, that I think the shortest one is just over 5,000 words. And we've actually got one that's well over 10,000 and is really a research article in its own right now. Looking at the case studies, and I think it's worth going through all of these briefly just to give you a sense of quite what it's possible to do with this material. We're back to the beats again. We had somebody looking at beat literature in the UK Web Archive. How institutions react to crisis with their online presence, focusing on the BBC. Non-UK people may not be aware, but that the BBC has been going through a bit of a crisis recently as all sorts of horrible things have been uncovered about their television presenters during the 70s and 80s. And it was looking at how an institution like the BBC that's committed to keeping its information online actually silently starts to correct things sometimes because they're deemed offensive in light of new information coming forward. I think it's a fascinating project. A history of UK companies on the web, looking, for example, which grocery stores were the first to deliver online, that sort of information. Digital barriers and the accessible web, how the major disability groups in the UK have been using the web, and as a sub-project for that, whether their original web offerings were compliant with W3C accessibility standards at the time, so whether they were practicing what they were preaching. Looking at the London French and a community, a self-defined community, and how they use the web, and how non-UK people are present in the UK web space. And the second set, looking at British Euroscepticism in the UK Web Archive, of which unfortunately there's rather a lot. Looking for public archaeology in the Web Archive. That public history, public archaeology dimension was something that researchers are very interested in. And I think that the web is a really important resource for researchers working in that area because it's a key interface between academics and the public. Looking at poetry networks online, are the local, very strong community ties that exist around poetry reading and so on, are they reflected in online contexts? Looking at citizen historians and citizen scientists related to that and how they've responded to commemorative activity, collecting family mementos. Again, that ties in with things that we've heard about this afternoon. And finally, the online development of the Ministry of Defence, and particularly how it's used the web for recruitment over the past 10 to 15 years. Just a few of the things that researchers have come up with. We didn't guide what they were doing. We let them come up with how they wanted to do it themselves, and some of them have used tools that we didn't recommend. They've just gone away, developed an interest, and done it themselves. And this is a visualization of links from the Territorial Army in the UK to other military and government websites that one of them produced. And this is looking at how 3 major disability organisations in the UK occur. So just simple word searching for how they occur in the Web Archive. The Royal National Institute for Blind People at the top, MENCAP, which is a mental health charity, in the middle, and then below that, the Royal National Institute for Deaf People. That particular project threw up some interesting questions around language evolving, because there's been a tendency for disability organisations to move away from terms that are not, that are deemed quite offensive in some categories now. For example, the Spastic Society in the UK is now called SCOPE. But scope is a very, very hard word to find and make sure that you're getting material that you want about that particular disability. Something very self-descriptive, like the Royal National Institute for Blind People, is easy to look for. Other terms, much less so, and that's a problem that became more apparent as we moved towards the more recent past. So at the end of this process, we wanted to find out what researchers wanted and how that could then be supported by the British Library. A number of things came out. I think the first thing probably to say is that researchers don't always want what they think they want. And that was one of the real benefits of having people engaged throughout the lifetime of the project, because the things that people instantly thought they would need turned out actually not to be and were less interesting and dropped down the list. I think particularly geolocation and sentiment analysis were the things that people went to straight away, and then actually found that was less useful or the data was too problematic. I think Neil's mentioned postcodes earlier, and that was a particular problem of differentiating between a postcode that's meaningful or one that's simply the postcode of a generic publisher. So you actually can't tell what that particular website is about in geographical terms because it's about Yorkshire, but it's published from somebody in London. The ability to create corpora was something that emerged very, very clearly. Once they've got a sophisticated mechanism for building queries, they want to be able to take that data away and not run the queries again. And then once they've got a corpus, they want to be able to annotate, curate that data, and analyse it. A lot of it within the browser, actually. I think for humanities researchers, the idea of having to download a special tool that you work with on your own computer is a bit off-putting. So they want to be able to do a certain amount of this in the browser. Not all of it, and not really complicated corpus linguistics, but just to get a start for it. And then again, tying in very much with what Kathy was talking about earlier, they were concerned about the ethical implications of all this and the fact that you can use big data to pull out very important personal stories, and particularly given the fuzziness around concepts of private and public digital spaces. And they were very worried about how they as individuals approach this, and not hiding behind university ethics guidelines, but what your personal responsibility is when you're working with this kind of data. And above all, they want to know what's going on. This is complicated, very complicated, but they don't want the black box approach. They really want to know what's happening. They want to understand the data. They want to understand what they're doing so that they're confident in their search results. Something that came up in connection with that is the relative lack of sophistication of the way in which people search. And I think that's algorithmically ranked search to find the most relevant result is what people are used to. And that's not very appropriate for this type of data when you're doing much more analytical work. And that's why they needed to know what was happening. Otherwise, they didn't understand the search results that were coming up. Why wasn't the single most meaningful thing at the top? And once people understood that, in some cases, they found that quite liberating. You're not going in with preconceived ideas. It's serendipity is happening again. You don't know what you're going to get, and sometimes that can be absolutely fascinating. Sometimes it can be completely infuriating, and you think you're never going to get what you want out of it. But it's a very different approach, and it's something that people are really going to have to relearn how they search. Problems, a lot of which have come up already today, is the messiness of the data. It was described even as it's unknowable. I'm never going to get to grips with this. There are so many different things that are competing and going on here that it's impossible for me to understand it. That's true in part, but you can get some of the way there now, and that's going to get better. But we need to be aware that it's never going to be perfect. It's inherently messy data. The inability to distinguish between content types on a web page was also problematic for people doing any kind of linguistic research. They want to know what the main content of the page says, not what the advertising ticker across the top that's been captured, or the set of links down the side, or even if they are interested in that, they want to be able to analyse it differently. There's also, I think, for humanists in particular, this discomfort with the idea of it's not perfect, but it's good enough. And that's going to be a real cultural shift. That you're not going to the outlying cases, you can't check everything, you just want to be confident that what you're getting is robust enough to suggest areas of research and general trends of development. As I mentioned, over-reliance on approaches conditioned by algorithmically ranked search. In a sort of striking moment of self-awareness, I think, one of our researchers quite early on said, this is all making me realise how lazy I've got about searching. And I really need to go back to basics and think about how I'm doing. Otherwise, I'm just not going to get anywhere with this data. And underpinning a lot of it is a lack of training in quantitative methods. It's become very unfashionable, for example, in history, and to some extent, quantitative research discredited. So people don't have a grounding in basic statistics, and that's a bit of a hurdle for people to get over before they can really start to feel comfortable with it. I don't think it needs to be at any great level, but they need to have some understanding of how to manipulate that data. Otherwise, you're going to get erroneous claims made because they haven't entirely understood what's going on. So I think that's all for me before I hand over to my colleagues. But as you can see, these are the wonderful people that were involved in that project. And I particularly wanted to list the bursary holders, who are a fantastic group of early career researchers who really picked it up and ran with it. And we learned so much from them. I think the British Library learned a huge amount from them about what researchers need, and they learned a huge amount from the British Library about the kinds of questions that you can ask of developers and what you can expect them to do and what you really can't and what you should do yourself. But they really have been incredibly enthusiastic and are organising panel sessions in Denmark for a Web Archive conference without any prompting from us. So I'm really confident that they're going to go out and really advocate for this resource, this primary source, and these ways of working. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jane, for the wonderful introduction and insight into the research use cases. So I'm going to talk about, so the title of my presentation is Co-Developing Access to the UK Web Archive. So I'm going to focus on the development of a prototype, which is based on the requirement extracted from the use cases, which Jane already talked about. Very briefly, we have been archiving the web for about 10 years now, initially at small scale, selective, based on permissions, and since April 2013, implementing non-print legal deposit, which significantly increased the scale of our operations. So Andy already talked about the 3 components of the UK Web Archive, which in total counts about 8 billion resources and over 160 terabytes of compressed data. What I would like to stress is that strategically, from the very beginning, we decided not just to focus on content collection. I thought about why this was the case. I think one of the driving force behind this decision was actually the necessity to prove or to argue why web archiving was necessary. So it's simple. If nobody uses it, then there's no point keeping them. So we were desperate, showing how the things we collect might be used. I think that was probably the simple motivation behind that strategy. So over the years, we have proactively developed access and use to the web archive through close engagement with researchers. This project is not the only research project we have carried out. We've done other things as well, but I focus on this. I think it really illustrates and reflects in the best way how some of these collaborations over the years has delivered results. So without the generous support of the Joint Information Systems Committee in the UK, which is a Higher Education Funding Council, and AHRC, of course, and the Internal Archive, I don't think any of this work has been possible. This data set, the JISC Historical Archive from 1996 to 2013, really is important. It underpins all our engagement with researchers, and also, to some extent, it also complements the UK web collection. So to give you a bit of a scale, 57 terabytes estimated, close to 4 billion URLs. The interface, the experimental interface delivered by this project, which I'm going to talk about, is actually only supported by a subset of this data set, the first tranche. We haven't got round to index and include everything, as Jane mentioned, a 15-month project, including recruitment and setup. It was a bit of a challenge and rush. And also to say how important it is that despite that there was no local access, the use of condition attached to this data set was very generous. So we could make available secondary data sets which have been used by researchers. My colleague Josh later on will show you some of these results. So the model of this project we employed really is an immersive interaction between ourselves and the researchers. At every stage, it's collaboration and co-design. So the use cases articulated by the researchers form the basis of our requirements extraction or abstraction. And then we refine these requirements following feedback by the researchers. We follow the iterative development cycle. We look at the requirements, we develop a prototype, we take them to the users, have them, they have a go, they play with it, have a go at it, and come back and tell us what needs to be changed. So we, based on using the articulated research questions, we arrived at a set of generalized use cases, which really is quite varied. From the list of the use cases, you can tell that some people have a better idea about what they're looking for, some don't. Some would like to take data set away and play themselves. So look at this, it's really almost like a scenario of that you need to come up with something which pleases everybody, which is quite a challenge. A set of high-level requirements were extracted based on the use cases, which include query building, corpus formation and handling, annotation and curation. And once the corpus is formed, people want to analyze that and expand that beyond the corpus and include the whole data set. Because it's a short project, we have not achieved everything that has been asked for. We have come up with a prototype called Shine. Because of time, or because of me not being brave enough, I've decided not to do a live demo. I'm going to make available their address, have a look at them. But I've taken a few screenshots just to illustrate what it is capable of. Let me see. So there is full text search, which is the main way of finding content in this interface. There are proximity options, and also you can exclude specific text strings from what you're searching. And also, once you have found something, you're typically facing or looking at a lot of search results, and there is a multifaceted filter. There's a set of multifaceted filters which you can apply, including content type, public suffix, domain, crawl year, etc. And there are more. There are others such as postcode, links to public suffix, language, and links domain. And there's, of course, also the ngram search, which I think is becoming quite common in some of the experimental user faces related to web archives. I have done I've searched the term or the names of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. I think these are familiar names to everyone, two former UK prime ministers. But what I've done is actually doing the same search in two data sets. This one, the one on the top, is the just historical web archive, and the one in the bottom is the open UK web archive, which is a much smaller selection. So I did this ngram search, and just by looking at the graph, I think you would not think that they show you the same trend. But if you knew the information or the scope of the collections, they actually do show similar trends broadly, because the smaller selective archive contains content collected from 2004, and there's much less content in there. I think, therefore, the graph appear much more crashed. And the bigger historical archive spans a much longer time scale. But if you look at 2004, from this point onward, can people see me pointing? I don't know how to point to this. Anyway, so if you look at the top graph, just ignore the bit before 2004. The general trend are more or less. Okay, right. So I think it's, if you disregard that, just look at 2004 and match that with the beginning of this graph. The general trend is that Gordon Brown, or the appearance of Gordon Brown in both data sets, took over Tony Blair at some point, which is natural. I think that happened around December 2017, when Gordon Brown became the prime minister. But it's interesting, actually, to drill down a little bit and look at the details related to Turning Point. I didn't realize myself that within the smaller collection, about 10% of the search results actually only came from one single website, because it was a selective archive. It came from Downing Street number 10. And it's all about Gordon Brown's, what he did as a prime minister, first week in office, and on and on. I flipped through 67 pages. That's where I lost patience, and I didn't have the time, because I couldn't actually determine just through the user interface whether all of those 4,000 results came from that one domain. It's possible, but I couldn't determine that just using the user interface. And then if you look at the other data set, the top graph, it shows a much more variety of websites and pages. They're from news sites, there are blogs, and also there were quite a few articles commenting on how Gordon Brown has been overshadowed by Tony Blair. So the point I'm trying to make here is like, it's all great, that you can generate Ngram, you can generate all these graphs and show the trend and the big picture, but without understanding the scope of your collection, how the data is collected, without the ability of drilling down to examine the details, it could be really misleading, and therefore probably not very useful. And also another point I want to make is that visualization is really not the end point, it's rather the starting point at times. So when we designed the trend analysis in the Shine interface, we realized that people not only need access to the big picture, but there is also a need to drill down to see the details. It's a shame that Windsurf is not here. We searched the word Google in the GIST historical web, and by examining the random samples supporting that data or supporting that trend, we actually came across an individual resource, one of the first ones. So this is a page archived by the Internet Archive in 1997, which this one particular resource there reads, "I'm 13 years old, and no, I'm not one of those teenagers who just like to Google at Gillian Anderson's picture all day." So we're pretty sure this is a typo rather than a proper occurrence of the term Google. So, but without access, this again illustrates a good point of not just having the big picture, really just tells you half of the story. Andy already mentioned this secondary data sets. They are used by researchers associated with the Oxford Internet Institute, but there were also other researchers who had made use of this. We know about a MA thesis from the University of Amsterdam. We knew a student from the Chinese University of Hong Kong who had independently used this data set. Unfortunately, we don't always know about them, but that in itself, it's a good thing in my view, because that's the beginning of the independent use of web archive data without us becoming the bottleneck, or without the need of having to contact us to ask about the specifics of the data. As I mentioned, we didn't manage to finish everything. I think we managed to carry out all the searches with these functions I've talked about. You're able to save a query and export that as comma-separated files or similar. And by the way, here is the URL where you can experiment or play with the interface. There is still a lot left to do, and although the project has ended, this work will not end. It will continue. We will continue to work on this. One of the things we need to do is the inclusion of the full GISC data set, and our ambition is actually a seamless interface to all three components of the UK Web Archive, a piece of work we're going to start very soon. And we need to provide better support for corpus creation, annotation and sharing of the corpus, and probably a set of standard analysis and visualization of the corpus, faceted search within a user-defined corpus, sorry about the typo there. And also, the filters we currently use, they're very useful, but how about the semantic aspects of the search results? Can we cluster them in some way to help filter the search results? And also, I also want to emphasize that what Jane mentioned earlier, researchers don't always necessarily know what they want, and we change our mind. So this set of requirements is not set in stone. We need to continue to work with them to understand how their requirements evolve as well. A set of lessons learned. This has changed some practices in terms of how we archive data, how we provide access. It's a learning process just for the researchers as for us, but the close engagement or interaction helped to remove some of these barriers. I think in the last 8 years, that's how long I'm in this job myself, I think we also went through a phase. We started from individual resources, small data, and then we moved into big picture, looking at big data analysis. And then we seem to have realized now it's really not a choice between big or small data. You sort of need both. What we are required to provide is the flexibility of moving between the two. You find a data point, you're able to move from that data point to the context, to the bigger picture, but then you want to drill back down and examine some of the details as well. So the term microscope has been used in the context of a parallel discussion within the UK humanities research community. Those interested, can ask questions. I think Jane's quite in tune with that discussion. And also we realized, and which also became, I think, apparent from the presentation from Niels this morning, context, paratext, information behind the scene, how things work under the hood, that's just as important as the static HTML text you print on user's screen. User expectation or assumptions, huge impact on how we develop our tools. If what people are not looking for is for us to make decisions in terms of ranking search results, so what other things we can look at to help them to go through and find things in a massive web archive. I don't think we have found the answers yet. Scale remains a challenge. We already have over 160 terabytes of data. I think Roger is going to, my colleague Roger over there, our CRO engineer, is preparing for this year's domain CRO again. This will continue to grow. We haven't found the answer, and there's a lot of work to do. But one thing I think that helps for both of us as the provider of the National Web Archive and the researchers, is maximum transparency. So I'll end on that note and give the floor to Joshua.
Great, well, thanks for having all of us here today. I think it's been a really positive day of discussions, and hopefully I can follow on from what Helen and Jane have been talking about and really move on to present some of the findings and some of the research outputs of all this hard work that's been done in terms of making this data, this big data, available for analysis. So what my brief here is to introduce the book, which is another output of the Buddha project. This is going to be an edited book, the title's there, edited by Niels Brugger, who you've heard from today already, and my colleague Ralph Schroeder from the Oxford Internet Institute. And that's a multi-authored work. We've commissioned chapters from a large number of leading researchers in this field, using both UK data and other research data sets, for example, from Denmark. I'm going to be just talking through research using the UK data, and mostly or entirely research conducted by myself and my colleagues at the Oxford Internet Institute. The book is forthcoming in 2015, that should say early 2016 actually, and it's going to be with UCL Press with open access, appropriately enough. So the 4 chapters which I'm briefly going to run through are listed here. I'll start at the top. So one of the things we want to do in this book is give kind of an overview of the domain dataset in total. This is a chapter by Taha Yassiri and Scott Hale at the Institute, but it's research which first appeared at website. The reference there is down the bottom. And it's really a data set of node and link data from the UK domain, one of the data sets we got from the British Library. Now, Andy touched on this earlier, actually, but for those of you who don't know, in the UK, we're quite blessed with how the domain, UK domain is structured. We have meaningful second-level domains, which is to say .co.uk, .org.uk, .gov.ac.uk, and .ac.uk, which represent commercial companies and general websites, charities and NGOs, government bodies, and universities and academic institutions. So what we're able to do is use these kind of the implicit meaning hidden in these subdomains to be able to say something about how these domains, what they look like in context of the whole domain and how they link to each other. So this shows the kind of overall size of these second-level domains within the UK archive. The eagle-eyed amongst you will notice 2 pieces of errata here. One, the chart on the left is only actually logarithmic on the y-axis, but that shows the overall size of the different domains. You can see the color coding at the bottom over time. And the diagram on the right shows them in absolute terms, just these 4. The second sort of, maybe not error, but contradiction at least to what Andy presented earlier, is that this data, which runs from 1996 to 2010, suggests that the co.uk domain was pretty much dominant for the whole period, and the others are much smaller. So on the right, you can see it's at all times it's more than 85% of the UK domain is .co nodes. We're not quite sure how that contradicts with Andy's suggestion, which actually AC was bigger originally, and then there was some crossover. But the good thing is the trends are in the right direction. So as Andy suggested in his research, there is the early role for academia and government, which is somewhat intuitive, given the role that these kind of organizations played in the start of in kicking off the web. But over time, both .org and .co sites grow dominant. But I think in some ways what's more interesting is how these domains kind of talk to each other. So I'll just talk through this chart, which is going to be appearing in the chapter, I think. And this looks at how, as I say, how the different domains link to each other. So the color of the bands in the middle relates to the color of the linking from domains. So the big green blob there is links from the .co.uk domain to .gov.uk domain. Now I should say this has been normalized for the size of the target domain. So if we were to leave this completely in total, the .co links would be enormous because the .co domain itself is enormous. But we've normalized for the size. So you can see here that government actually gets really kind of punches above its weight, gets a lot of links from .co domains to the government. Maybe that's relying on some kind of authority in terms of links. And the same to an extent with academia. I'm quite partial to the red strip in the AC section, which appears to be linking to itself, which says something about academics, if you ask me, how we're more interested in talking to ourselves than perhaps anyone else. But there's other kind of interesting patterns which you can really draw out here from the kind of thematic second-level domains which we're able to look at here. So I think that gives a nice broad overview of not only the size and the relative composition of the UK domain, but how the different subdomains talk to each other. And to me, it's the early startings of a view of how society talks to itself, which I think is really exciting. The second chapter I want to talk about is a chapter by Jonathan Bright and myself, also looking at nodes and links, but this time purely from the bbc.co.uk website, and specifically from the BBC News website. So what we want to do in this, and unfortunately I'm only able to speculate rather than present you findings of this because we haven't quite got to the findings yet, but what we want to look at is outbound links from the BBC News website to other parts of the web, and specifically to other national domains. Now, as you obviously know, there's top-level domains, country code top-level domains, which link to other countries' parts of the web. And we're kind of using this as a proxy for what we're using a link to an external foreign website as a proxy for coverage, which is quite a nice way of doing it, because obviously with certain notable examples, for example, Tuvalu.tv, who famously sold their country code domain, normally it's a pretty good idea of coverage in the site. So what we want to do is weigh up the relative number of links going out from the BBC website to different countries, essentially, with different variables. And the things we're going to be looking at, the independent variables we're going to look at include things like wealth, human development index, the distance from the UK, membership of the somewhat archaic Commonwealth nations, so basically members of the old British Empire, to see whether, let's say, African states which were originally British empires, part of the British Empire, get linked to more than African states which were originally part of the French Empire, to see whether those old historical legacies still have some weight in modern-day news coverage. So that's, I think, going to be, again, quite interesting, and it's quite a useful way of using the proxy of the what's covered in the news site as a wider view of the sort of news priority of an actual news organization. And the third thing which I want to mention is this chapter called 15 Years of British Universities on the Web. Again, part of this research appeared in earlier form in the website paper we had last year, but it's going to be written by Eric Meyer and Taha Isiri. And again, this is nodes and links from 1996 to 2010. In this, we identified 121, or basically all universities in the UK from a set of league table rankings. And we want to look at the effect of how these different independent variables on how these universities link to each other. So we're going to weigh up whether their membership of different research groups, which I'll talk about, has any impact, whether their actual league table ranking has an effect, and indeed whether their geographic location, similar to the distance mentioned in the BBC paper, whether that has any effect. And I'm going to present these findings in sort of ascending order of significance found. The first one we're looking at is the different group affiliations. So a quick word on this. Most universities in the UK are members of different groups. It's something perhaps slightly, the Russell Group is perhaps slightly akin to Ivy League, but slightly more formal in terms of how the research, they actually collaborate on research together to a greater extent. And there's other groups there as well. And your first instinct when looking at this graph is probably right. It doesn't tell us much. This is the network diagram where colors have different colors of different groups. And it doesn't look like much is going on there. And indeed, this is borne out. If you were to create 5 random clusters of universities, you'd find no greater sort of network effects than what we find with the actual 5 networks. There is some, the green blobs are the Russell Groups, Russell Group universities, which are somewhat more prominent or have certainly greater sort of budgets. And we think that's the only group that has any kind of effect. And we think that might be purely because they're big universities doing lots of research, and big universities do greater amounts of research. That might be why there's greater strength of hyperlinks within the data set. Secondly, we look at league table rankings. And here we can see sort of some interesting moderate effects. So we looked at 10 different rankings of network centrality. And the strongest effect we found was for 2010, looking at in-strength, so the number of hyperlinks, the number of hyperlinks going between different universities in this case. And we did find that how high a university is in the league tables does affect how linked to it is by other universities. Now this kind of bears out in practice. You might think that the bigger universities, the better ranked universities, may be doing better research, thus more worthy, research that's more worthy to be linked to, and that's kind of borne out. We find some decent correlation there. But interestingly, perhaps most interestingly, is the longitudinal effect. So in 2005, you can see on the left there's not a huge amount of correlation. This is the top 10 rows, but in 2010 that's got stronger. And whether this represents some kind of Matthew effect, some kind of rich get richer effect amongst research, we don't know. I mean, what we can say from this quite definitively is that clearly the internet hasn't completely transformed traditional academic power structures, which is in itself quite interesting. But we can't necessarily explain the increase in centrality over time between those 5 years in the data, but it's interesting nonetheless. And finally, looking at distance, does the effect of distance have any effect on how willing universities are to link to each other on the web, which in some senses shouldn't make sense, right? Because we'd expect that the web is a liberating tool which allows us to virtually overcome lots of sort of old-fashioned offline geographic boundaries. But actually, again, we do find that this does have some effect. In the maps on the left, the lines are the sort of strength of the links between the different universities. You can see a real hot, particularly in 2005, really strong links between a cluster of southern universities, including London and Oxford, I think, and a few others. That kind of wanes relative to the overall proportion of links in the database by 2010. But we do find that we do find quite a strong, clear inverse relationship between how far universities are from each other and their density of links within the data set for all 3 years. So that's the third paper. The third chapter that I want to talk about. The fourth one, which I'm going to write up, is what's called Cultures of the UK Web, but that name is clearly to basically to disguise the diversity of things which we'll be covering, because what I'll be doing in this is writing up the findings and some of the lessons learned from the 10 researchers that Jane described earlier. They've done lots of fantastic work. As Jane says, the reports came in a bit longer than we necessarily asked for, which is great. Less great for me because I've got to read through them all. But no, they're really good and really worth reading, and they all present not only substantive challenges, but also, not only substantive findings, but also some really kind of reflective and thought-provoking ideas about what we can do with this research. Ideally, I'm going to make this fairly systematic, so how many of the 10 researchers took sort of top-down approaches and how many took bottom-up sort of using specific search terms from the start. But that chapter 2 is very much a work in progress. So drawing on all of these and this quite diverse set of research which is going on at my institute, not to mention all the stuff that's going on elsewhere as well, I do nonetheless think you can pull out a few lessons from all these things. Obviously, as I said, there's a huge range of potential for exploration. I don't know what it says, exploration and explanation, I'm supposed to say. But numerous challenges clearly do remain. I think what we drew out from a lot of this is sort of taking the web and web archives for what it is and what they are. So using things that are sort of born native web phenomena like hyperlinks, which is something which we have analogies to in the offline world, but is in many ways is quite a new phenomenon, and Niels has written a lot about this, what a link actually means and what it says. Now, obviously, that's very context-specific in many different uses of the internet, but nonetheless, we can take the links to mean something at different times, and the great thing about that is it's all stored within the data set. So in some ways, we're not imposing kind of our own sense of what a link means onto the data set. And also, as I say, the subdomains, the second-level domains we have in the UK is another great way of taking the web as it is, seeing that it's, in the UK case, it's made up of substantive sectors of society, essentially, and using that as a way to drive analysis. But I suppose the corollary of that is that also, where possible, it's great to draw in offline data for independent variables, whether this is data about universities or about Human Development Index for looking at the BBC coverage. So where possible, it is good to have a really clear set of online data which we can use as sort of independent variables for analysis. But I want to end on quite a positive note. I think despite the many methodological challenges and technical issues inherent to using web archives, we are coming up to, and I think this book will push us even further in the direction of having a really thorough and rigorous set of meaningful findings using web archives. And I think there's a lot of room for optimism and potential. And I think the project that we've been working on for the past year and a bit has really pushed us and proved to us that it's possible to do good, valid academic research, building on all the hard work that's been done with web archives in this area. So thank you very much for your time, and I think we'll have some questions.
Well, that was great. Do we have any questions? Wait a second, the roving mics are coming. Hold your... just at the front here, Daniel. The rest of you can think up some good ones.
Hi, I'm Daniel, Portuguese Web Archive. So thank you very much for this very inspiring session. It was really great. And I have two questions. The first one is, will the case study reports be available? Okay. And the second one is about the n-gram work that you did. I really would like to do the same in my web archive. So could you talk a little bit about how does it work? How does it scale? How can your software be reused?
Shall I take the first one? Is this working?
Yeah.
Yeah. About the case studies. When I get round to editing them, which will be, I hope, very soon, next 2 or 3 weeks, we're going to make the full case studies available on the project website. And then, as Josh mentioned, there'll be the summary version in the book, but they will be there with links to all of the sites that they've looked at and all of that. So I hope it's going to be a fantastic resource for people to really see what you can do with this material in, a year. So yes. And I'll hand over to Helen for the engram.
Okay, so if I probably can't tell you the very details, but what I do know is that the engram search in essence is supported by a full text index underneath the Solr index, the visualization and the pointers to the specific search result is all surrounding. It's on top of the Solr index. Scale, I think we hit some problems there. What else? I think the best person to answer this question, is probably Andy Jackson, which, either we can give the floor to him so that he can tell you the details, or you could, so what exactly...
Would you like a mic, Andy?
But Daniel, what do you already have a full text index? And what kind of scale are you?
Okay. Yeah, no, so you already answered. We have a full text index, but it's not Solr, but probably it will work with a little tuning. So you kind of helped me already. And about the visualization tool that you developed, so that software we could reuse or not?
Yes. So our entire stack's open source and built on open source tools. You're more than welcome to use any of it. It's all on our GitHub site. We're basically using Solr's faceted search. So we index the time and use Solr's time-based faceting capabilities. So you can say, give me every 6 months, give me every year, whatever, to build the temporal facet. And then that graph just becomes a way of looking at the temporal facet, right? So it's the faceted search capability that powers it. And the UE is just based on the Solr API with that assumption.
Thank you.
No worries.
Sorry, I just want to add, when we distribute the slides, what I can do is to add the GitHub address, including the code, to the slides so that everybody can see them.
Fantastic. Any more questions? It wouldn't be right if Nicholas didn't ask a question.
Can I have two questions also?
Sure.
The first one is for Josh. So I'm interested to know if there were any research questions you wanted to answer but weren't able to because of the way the data was structured, or missing metadata, or missing contextual information, that kind of thing.
Sure, yeah. I think probably the BBC paper is a good case study for this. Yeah, I think over the process of using web archives for research, you start to internalize things which at the start are you feel quite more vividly, namely that you can't ask everything you want to ask, and that it's always going to be shaped by the data that's available. And when you're working with technical teams, as Helen mentioned, by that liaison with the technical teams providing the data. I think in the BBC case, it's interesting. There's limitations on it. So the way we're analyzing the data, we can't necessarily separate different kinds of links. So again, it's quite contextual. So there's, in the case of BBC articles, there's links to other websites, and then there's also kind of embedded links within the page. So there's kind of little things which throw off the analysis quite a lot. But more generally, I think all the researchers had questions they couldn't answer, and obviously we're painting, we should paint a positive picture of how that process was, but there's always kinks in the road. And I think the reports are going to be, and hopefully the chapter I write, is going to be a really good way of pinpointing or trying to generalize what many of those were. It certainly wasn't just for want of technical functions. It was more, I think in many cases, the nature of the data itself and what you can and can't do with web archives. But it was great to see that process take place through the eyes of of researchers coming across it for the first time.
Right. I think that'll be very valuable information, because a lot of times we think of researchers giving feedback to the access systems, but if they can give feedback to how it was originally crawled and that kind of thing, that can be really useful. Second quick question is to Helen. Through this study, you found that researchers have expectations, or they would like to be able to extract content, they'd like to be able to do some analysis directly within their browser, and these are things that would take a lot of computational resources if you provided them. Have you accepted the fact that you will have to provide large amounts of computational infrastructure for researchers?
It did, I think, gradually dawned on us that some of the things to do properly and to continue to do it and to commit to doing them forever is going to be very, very expensive. There are things we need to do. The legal framework helps, and I think I'm just speaking really about the British Library. I think over the years, although we did have to be really alert and be conscious of the fact that we constantly need to make a case and demonstrate our value, but at an institutional level, I think there has always been great support for web archiving. This worries me to some extent, knowing how much hardware, how much storage we need to add to our cluster, and knowing how much data is being created. I don't know if there is a point that we probably need to say to all ourselves, this is where we can't afford anymore, where we need to stop. So for the time being, we're good, because there was project money, and there's institutional support, and there's researcher support. But over long run, to make this a mainstream institutional activity, I think it still requires quite a lot of convincing.
Can I add something on that? What we were encouraging the researchers to do is, if they create a corpus, they can perhaps deposit it in an institutional repository, for example, so that it's available, but it's not the responsibility of the British Library to keep all of these individual corpora available, because, as you say, that's going to get very expensive very quickly. So we were trying to encourage people to think about other ways in which they could make the data available themselves in a way that's sustainable.
If we'll come to Nicholas in a minute, I think.
Okay, can I have two questions also?
Can you say who you are?
Oh, sorry. I'm Sarah from the National Library of France. I have a question for Helen. I was wondering what's a corpus behind the scene? I mean, is it data that you're taking apart from your archives and putting somewhere else? Is it an index that you're separating from the rest?
Sorry, did you ask what's
a corpus behind the scene? How do you shape it? What's in it?
Good. Mic to Andy,
I didn't
please.
understand the question. Okay. If you understood the question, yes, by all means, Andy. Sorry.
So a corpus in our interface, it starts life as the set of documents which match a query. So you build a corpus by tuning a query until it matches your intent. And this goes from the high level, anything which includes this word, down to actually I want to pick out these hosts because no, they're not right, and I want to whitelist in these hosts because they're definitely right. And then that very complicated query gets kind of siphoned off as a corpus, which is basically a tagged subset of the collection. They are difficult to sustain over time, those tagged subsets, so we're not quite going to show how that's going to work out. But essentially, it's the results of a query.
You had a second question? I think if we go to Nicholas, then I think I might draw a close on questions after that. No, just you still yeah.
So I think this is a question mostly for Helen, but I'm happy to have anyone answer it. And is perhaps also a little bit speculative. I'm curious about which lessons you would most commend to the managers of other web archives from your experience with this Buddha project. So for example, do you think is it the iterative design process and working with researchers? Is it the specific insights that you came up with from your own experience? Is it the tools? Is it something else? What do you think might be the most replicable for other institutions sort of following this model?
Yeah, I think that so one thing, if you ask me to pick one thing that is without, so the engagement with researchers has changed some of the practices of how we develop the next generation access to web archives. So we are getting ready to redevelop the Open UK Web Archive. One of the things we want to do, for example, is to I'll mention two features just as an illustration of how some of this learning has changed the practice of doing things. One is that for the convenience or the thinking about general public, what we want to do is to put all the inactive website, which, you know, those websites which have disappeared from the web, in one obvious place, so that people know, you know, the first thing they see is like these websites within this web archive are no longer live on the live web. Why do we do that? I think statistics, usage statistics show people actually come to the web archive currently because they want to look at those websites which have become inactive. So that's an obvious thing to do, and would justify the fact that our operations are funded by taxpayers as well. So we want the UK public know where to go to if they can't find a website on the live web. That's one thing. And second thing is how, you know, we do face a problem in that our own legal deposit content is not publicly accessible. We got the JISC data set that give us some hands-on experience to play with data at that scale, but still that doesn't help us resolve the restricted access to our own legal deposit content. But the fact that the realization of people, of researchers' interest, not just in the text, but also the contextual information, the metadata, and everything else around that, probably gives a way out to some extent. So when we develop our new tool, what we want to do is to have a interface on top of all components of the UK Web Archive, so at least people can discover what we have. Not necessarily providing full text access, because you can't at times, but at least you can tell people what you have, and you can show people metadata about them. And the ambition really is to actually link to other web archives as well. So these I think these are the two examples of how this close engagement with researchers have taught us lessons, and how that might shape and change the way we provide access and even collect data.
Well, thanks very much. I think that was our last talk. So I'd just like you to show your appreciation for our last session. But to finish the day, Paul is just going to give a few words.
So I only have about 10 or 15 slides, so this should go quickly. No, always a daunting task of trying to summarize, and I'm certainly not going to summarize the whole day here in 2 minutes, but hopefully as we all walk off, and I'll give you some tips and so forth for dinner and breakfast tomorrow morning, but as it's very heartening, I find, to listen to the talks and to see the way we've spoken about technology. We've talked about personal impact of web archiving. We've talked about some of the institutional impacts. And I think as an organization, we've come a long way from talking about actually harvesting the web and the issues around getting at the information. And we're at a point now of trying to make it relevant to our clients, to make it relevant to researchers, to the general public. And I think that's, you know, some of the discussions we had around the value and some of the videos we didn't get to see, but they'll be up online for sure, that the British Library has done around describing what is the inherent value around archiving the web and what actually can people get from it. I think the one piece that came out of all the discussions today, I've been quite happy to have Kathy Hartman, who's the co-chair this year, type up some notes and give me some thoughts and some context around this. And really, the one word that does come out is that context really matters. And the way I broke it down was in 3 areas: the context of generations. So we heard from Susan, Kathy, Megan, talking about the tracks we leave, the digitally lived lives, and the context that, yeah, the Kodachrome, the Super 8s go away. Facebook is maybe going to go away. NSA, yes. People saying no. Sounds like a good conversation over a pint later on tonight. The fact that your IT person in the family is not your archivist. That whole context of generational thinking has to be taken into account as we continue to move forward. And what does that mean from an archiving, both from a harvesting perspective, but also from an access perspective? The second part was around the context of user expectations and time. So I think this morning with Vint and Satya looking at, the Olive tool and distilling out the technology and getting to the data. I mean, that's what, it's a brilliant, from a technologist perspective, from my perspective, living and having grown up being a technologist, it's fantastic to see that happen. But once you get beyond the shine of that, the real reason that's there is to present the data and the information back. So we can't get too taken by the shiny bit on the ground. We have to actually look at what the value that thing is actually trying to create. And I think, again, that demonstrates the maturity of the discussion that we're actually starting to have. So there's still some legal issues, some technical issues around that, but it'll be that'll be sussed out over time. And the last area is really the context of the data and the information. And I think, whether you listen to Helen, Jane, and Josh, or Niels and Andy, the whole concept of, Googling girls is probably not what was really meant. It was, we got to look at the contextualization of the information that's out there. And when you hear about 60% of URLs not being valid after 2 years, we have to really look at that and say, okay, is there a better way to be going at this? Are we going at the right level of information? So just some ideas. That's my total summary for the day. I don't want to delve any further into that, but hopefully it gives you something to talk about this evening. If you're not already following on Twitter, there's a sub discussion going on during every one of the presentations, and it's fantastic. So the hashtag is IIPC GA2015, and there's a bunch of people. I won't name them out in the room, but there's some fantastic conversations going on. So if you haven't started, please feel free. I want to thank you for your audience, your engagement, the questions. It really, hopefully for you it felt like that. I know for Nicholas it definitely felt like a dialogue with each one of the speakers up here. But hopefully for the rest of you it also felt like a dialogue, and it was heartening to hear the questions. And if you have any more, the speakers are among us for the most part. So dinner tonight, in your red Stanford books, you should have received a listing of all kinds of restaurants to head to. I said there was about 30 countries represented here today. I think we've actually got restaurants from a good portion of them. So I encourage you to head out to one of them and enjoy the evening. And there's a good chance you'll run into some IIPCers because, well, Palo Alto is not a very big town. There's about 4 or 5 streets of the great restaurants, and so you'll probably find a conversation somewhere that you can join in. And just a reminder that tomorrow we will start at 9:30. There's no breakfast. There will be coffee served, and the presentations will start at 10 a.m. So with that, have a fantastic evening, and thank you again.